Hi everybody, I'm Suzette Martinez Standring and welcome to It's All Right with Suzette. And today we have a wonderful historical fiction novel by Connie Hertzberg Mayo. It's called The Island of Worthiy Boys. And what I love about it is that it is set on Thompson Island in the Boston Harbor Islands. I love those things that are close to home. And The Island of Worthiy Boys will be featured next year, 2017, as the One Book, One Town selection in Sharon. And that is the equivalent of Milton reads. So it's a wonderful book. I've been recommending it to all my friends. Welcome to the show, Connie Mayo.
Thank you very much.
Before we start about The Island of Worthiy Boys, I'd like you to brag on yourself a little bit. Can you tell us about the big awards that it has received?
So I won the book won a gold medal for regional historical fiction from the Independent Publisher Book Awards. And also a silver medal for historical fiction from the INDIEFAB Awards. And these are both awards that are given to books by small independent publishers.
Well, that is fabulous. I read the book and I've been recommending it to so many of my friends. And I learned a lot about Thompson Island in the Boston Harbor Islands. So can you tell us why you chose that title and what your book is about?
Well, the title, I think, follows something that I felt really strongly about the book, which in the book there's a lot of the theme of sort of good and bad, and who is good and who is bad. And so the story is basically about two boys who have a rough time. They are indigent and life is difficult for them. And when they end up in this school, they're there under false pretenses. And so the school was really a place for boys who were of a certain caliber according to the admission standards. They came from sort of teetotaling families, and they came from church-going families and so forth. And so I really wanted to emphasize with the title the idea of, well, who is really worthy? Does that really make somebody worthy? Or can these, my protagonists, these two characters, who are petty criminals, can they be worthy boys as well?
Yes, and they come into the school under false pretenses. And it's really a great book. It has a wonderful pace. Now, because it centers from the viewpoint of the two young boys, Charlie and Aiden, is it a young adult book?
So I wrote this book as an adult, for an adult audience. And it never occurred to me that it could be a YA book. I never had a desire to write a YA book, but as soon as, sort of pretty much as soon as the ink had dried, I got this question, and it really floored me because I had not thought of this before. And a lot of people make the assumption because of the age of the protagonist, so they're 11 and 12 years old, that this might be a YA book, but I really don't see it as a YA book. I think it might have some crossover appeal. I think that the youngest person I've heard of who's read it has been like 11 or 12, but those are very precocious readers. I think the subject matter, ultimately, even though the protagonists are young, adolescents, I think the subject matter is very adult-oriented, so I see it as an adult book.
Mm-hmm. It delves into the poverty of their background. Let's lay a little bit of groundwork. The boys come from Boston, and talk about the time period. And one of the things that you paint so well is the situation of the indigent in Boston at the time, especially as illustrated in the lives of these young boys, and especially in the condition of Irish immigrants at that time. Can you share something about that part of history?
Well, of the two boys, one is of Irish descent, but he doesn't look like he's of Irish descent. So he ends up suppressing his accent and really passing for, sort of an American, if you will. And he does this because it was not always the easiest thing to represent yourself as an Irish immigrant at this time. There was a lot of discrimination against the Irish, and I think it was primarily when I sort of furthered my research into the book, it really struck me that it was not specifically because they were Irish, but because that population reached a critical mass, because of course it started with the Irish potato famine, and it really took decades for this for the population to really build to a critical mass. And I think that there's a lot of parallels today to immigration situations when the volume of immigrants reaches a certain point, there are people who will react in a fearful way. And that ends up coming out as discrimination. And so the more I learned about discrimination at this particular time in Boston against the Irish immigrants, it really resonated with a lot of things I think that you read about today in the news.
You know, it's interesting. One of the things I love about historical fiction is that you are educated in a very entertaining way about the way things used to be. I mean, it's so difficult now to imagine the discrimination against the Irish Americans because, you know, that population is so accomplished and has contributed so many wonderful things to society. But going back a little bit where you say the boy doesn't appear to be Irish, you know, in my mind it's like, well, he looks like the rest of the population, doesn't he? But talk a little bit about what were the hallmarks of someone being Irish and at that time, and how it would bring forth a lot of discrimination.
I think a lot of it had to do with the accent. So that's something that my character Aidan, suppresses, and he ultimately ends up going by another name as well, because his name is Aidan Sullivan, which is a very Irish name. And he doesn't have any sort of physical characters. He doesn't have red hair. He's sort of more darker complected, and so he finds that it's easier to sort of live his life in Boston in 1889, really sort of pretending to be who he's not, and then ultimately, not that this is any spoiler, but ultimately, sort of as he ages through, you ultimately find out that he really ends up owning, in the epilogue, he ends up owning, you know, his Irish heritage, which I found really satisfying to write. That he was back on his brogue, and he was who he was.
And Charlie. Talk about the character of Charlie, the other young boy, the friend.
So he has had a much rougher life than Aidan. He was part of a single family home. He's just lived with his mother. His father had run off. His mother died of smallpox in front of him, and he just took off and went to the streets. And so when you meet Charles at the beginning of the book, he's been homeless for almost 2 years and just fending for himself. In addition, he's not really very social. He doesn't have a lot of social graces, and so he has not been one of those homeless boys, of which there were many that teamed up in sort of roving gangs and would team together to try to find food and shelter together much more effectively. He's not a team player, and so he has to do this all alone, and so it's even harder for him. So when he ends up teaming up with Aidan, it's a little rocky because he's not really full of the social graces.
I love the dialogue. Your dialogue makes the book come alive, and you do a great job of the differences in the characters. So it's set in Boston, and you see the poverty, and you really paint a very vivid picture of the discrimination and the starvation and how difficult it was for children, and there were no resources at that time. So can you tell us a little bit now about, without any spoilers, now they find themselves on Thompson Island. What year is this, and what's going on Thompson Island at that time?
So the year is 1889, and on Thompson Island, really for about 150 years, there, starting in 1832, there was the Boston Farm School, which ultimately became the Boston Farm and Trade School as we went from a sort of agrarian society to more industrial society. And this was a school where boys could come ages 8 through 14, and they would come and they would learn farming, but they would also learn a trade. They would go to school, and when they were 14, the administration would get them an internship, some sort of job in Boston, whether it was with the telegraph company or the printing company. And so it was sort of a rare, good place that you could land when you were poor, and some of the boys were orphaned, others just came from families that were so poor they could not afford to keep them. And so there were a lot of bad places you could land, but as I did my research, I found out that this was actually sort of a good place that they could land, which was really, it was great to write about such a positive environment for them.
It was a very positive environment, and it was such an education for me to learn about that school and the schoolmaster. I think that it was very fascinating for me to understand the dynamic among the boys and to see how these two friends had to pose as brothers, you know, to get away from a crime situation that happened in Boston. So in a little bit, we're going to return to Connie Mayo and talking about the Island of Worthy Boys, and we're going to find out more about her historical research and her writing process about this truly terrific book. So stay tuned. And we're back with Connie Mayo, author of The Island of Worthy Boys. And in this book about Thompson Island, I have to tell you that I found it a very heartwarming story, as many of people have told you, many readers of your book. And tell me what was involved in the historical research regarding Thompson Island in the Boston Harbor.
Well, I had first learned about the school there when I was 25, long before I ever really ended up writing the book. And I had first, at that time, I had heard that there was a reform school the building has since burnt down in the 70s, but that there was a reform school there. And I had thought at that time, oh, that would make a really interesting novel. But at age 25, I was not, full-time working and, living in a condo in Brookline and living the life. There was not the time to write a book, especially since there was no internet back then. And so writing anything that required research required going to a library during library hours, and it was a non-starter at the time. But 20 years later, when I found myself with some time and my children were a little bit older and more self-sufficient, luckily the internet had been invented, and being able to research a historical novel was totally possible from home, although I did some research. The archives for the school are located at UMass Boston, so there's some things that are not scanned online digitally, and so I went to the archives to sort of, paw through their dusty boxes, which was a lot of fun. But most of the research that I did was online, and I did it, at odd hours, as you can, Google's always available, right?
That's fantastic. How long did it take you to complete your historical research and to write the book?
Well, I did a lot of research. I probably did maybe 6 months of research before I started writing, and then you're doing research and writing at the same time, because there's always, up until the last page, I think I was still researching little historical facts. But the first draft took 3 years. I took a year to edit it, and then it took another year plus to find a publisher, get a contract, and so forth. So really, from the time that I started writing it to the launch party was almost exactly 6 years.
6 years.
You have to be very patient to be a writer.
In a strange way, that's a perverse comfort, because a lot of writers beat themselves up that, oh, it's taken me so long.
Right. Oh, you should never do that. I mean, it takes how it takes, and I'm not sure that it really would have been so incredibly quick had I not been doing things like working and having kids, and life goes on, and so to me, it almost seems like I can't believe I did it that quickly based on all the other things I was doing at the time.
Now, what I also enjoyed about your book is you actually have historical photographs of Thompson Island and the boys' school. Is it still there? What is going, are there, it looks like there's some ruins there or something, or?
So, Thompson Island is currently the home of Outward Bound, and so
yeah, that's right.
They like to say that they are still sort of serving the same population because they're serving at-risk youth. Although they also do the corporate events and weddings and so forth, but they still do Outward Bound has a lot of programs with at-risk youth now. So unfortunately, the main building, which is there's a picture of it in the book, burned down in the 70s, and I would have loved to go and see that. So I did go out to Thompson Island, took the tour, but there's not much there. I mean, most of the buildings the oldest building, I think, was built in 1898, which is slightly after this, when my story was set. And then there's a lot of cinder block kind of dorms that were built in the 50s, which are sort of charmless, but so there's not a lot that's left. But you can see the foundation stones where the main house was. So I sort of stood there and tried to imagine what the house looked like.
You know, the schoolmaster is a very interesting character. Can you how much of him is fictional, or how much of his personality was drawn from your research? Tell us a little bit. He's a very interesting personality. He was a visionary in a lot of ways. And he is a character that adds to the heartwarming aspect of this book because he really does care so much about the boys and their future. Can you talk about his character, how you developed him, and some of the other characters on Thompson Island?
So he is a real historical figure, as is his wife, who is the matron. And when I did research, it's difficult to research somebody who was born and died so long ago, but there's a lot of evidence that he was a very progressive person, as well as just very kind. And I saw in the archives, I saw correspondence that sort of indicated he had maybe lent some of the students, as they went off and did their jobs in Boston, that he maybe lent them money when somebody's wife was sick, and he gets all these boys these jobs in Boston. And he seemed very kind and progressive, and he was very long-serving. He got the job when he was 28, and he basically died in the position in his 60s. So he was there. It was pretty much all of his career.
Now, it is a heartwarming story. And yet there are real elements of tension in the book, a lot of moments of uncertainty and, you know, some kind of dark things that go on. And I don't want to give away any spoilers, but do you want to address any of that?
Well, it's interesting to write about children, essentially. They're 11 and 12 years old. And part of the story is that they are in really difficult circumstances. And so doing some of the research to find out what it was like to be a child at that time, some of it was pretty rough. And there really was a reform school at the time, which is referenced in the book. And they did a similar age population, so boys, 8 to 14, maybe older. This is up in Westboro. But it was a very Dickensian kind of place where boys would be put in solitary confinement, and they would be on a diet of bread and water if they were being punished. I mean, things that I hope we would never do today. But so there were some really scary things that could happen. And one of the things that really struck me as I did the research for this book is, our social safety nets today may not be perfect, but life without any social safety nets was super perilous, and it was especially perilous for families. And I think children were the ones who really bore the brunt of this insecurity when there was not a foster care system, and there wasn't insurance, and it wasn't very common. There was no disability insurance. So if your dad got injured, there was, he was just out of a job, and that was it. So it was when you really think about it, it was quite scary back then.
You really capture the terror of these two young helpless boys who, now the boys' school, the positive environment was on Thompson Island. And you talk about this reform school, this reformatory, which was the other option. Where was that located?
That was in Westboro. In
Westboro, yes. And it was, like you say, a very Dickensian, dark, horrible, torturous place, especially for young boys. And you really, and I was fascinated with how you really educate the public about history at that time. Now, you mentioned that at the age of 25, you thought about this, Thompson Island, this school, and that was the spark for a possible novel. I'm always interested in the writing process. The two boys, how did you develop them? And how were you able to create the dynamic between the two that works so well in the overall story?
Well, when I first seriously started considering writing this book, the very first thought that I had was that I would write from the perspective of a young female teacher, which was really sort of a cheat, because I felt like, well, this is my first large writing undertaking, and that would be the voice that's the most comfortable for me to write. But I really quickly realized that that is not the most interesting voice from which to write, and that my obligation, if anybody was ever going to read this, was to write the most interesting story, not the story that I felt was safest for me to write. So I very early on decided to write from the perspective of the boys. And at the time, I think my son might have been about 10. So he aged through the ages of 11 and 12 during the writing of this book. He is, the boys are not modeled on him, but I think that I would not have been able to write the book in this type of detail had I not had a son and had been involved, had seen a lot of boys his age through the school system and so forth. So that really informed me. So when I look back and I think that I was considering writing this book briefly when I was 25, it really would not have been a very good book because I really just didn't have the life experience in order to write from the perspective of these boys at that time.
When you write historical fiction, what did you find helpful in that process? I mean, did you go to somewhere like Grub Street, or were you in a writing group, or did you draw on, what kind of resources did you draw on, or people who were helpful? Because I think that just to take an historical novel and then to place characters and to choose your characters, the vantage point, can be very paralyzing for people at the very beginning. So who helped you along with all of that?
Well, Grub Street was great, and I've been a longtime Grub member, and I would selectively take classes in things that I was struggling with sort of during this 3-4 year period where I was actively writing. So I did take a course at Grub on point of view. I took a course on historical fiction. So the things that really sort of it was very strategically selected, that I'm having trouble with this, I think I'll look for a course, and of course Grub always has a course that you need. So Grub Street was great, and the other thing that really helped me was I had a lot of beta readers. So once the manuscript was complete, I would give it to somebody who hadn't read any of it, somebody who was willing to devote a couple hours to reading the book and get feedback from them. So I think I had 4 or 5 beta readers, and that was very helpful. But that does come sort of at the end of the process, at the end of sort of your first draft, where you would go out and seek out beta readers. And I didn't have a writing group, although now I'm sort of considering it for the second novel. I'm thinking, should I do that? Because I know a lot of people have great experiences and great success with that. So it's something I'm considering, but it's not something that happened with the first book.
Now, beta readers, a lot of people are not familiar with that term. Where do you find your beta readers? That's a good question, and it can have a lot of answers. My beta readers were friends of mine, but you can actually solicit strangers. There are places on the internet where you can go and maybe do something reciprocal. I have a novel, you have a novel. Let's sort of be each other's beta readers. So and that might have some advantages in that you might get some more honest feedback, as opposed to asking your mother to be a beta reader. Maybe is not the best idea if you're looking for honest feedback. I'm always interested in people's writing process, how they do it, when they do it, and especially with you work as a systems analyst. So you have a job and you have a family. Where do you insert your writing time?
Writing really fits in between the cracks, it's not pragmatic to say I have 15 minutes, I think I'll start writing, because then when you finally get in the zone, then
yes,
there's your 15 minutes. So a lot of it was when my kids used to go to bed before me, not anymore, they're teenagers, but when they used to go to bed before me, a lot of it was sort of after they went to sleep, so it was evening time. And some weekend time, but it always had to fit in with everything else, because my family was my first priority and still are. So if you ask me to account for all of the time that would add up to writing this book, I could not account for it, because I don't see where I actually had all that time. It seems like, I don't know, something must have happened in my absence.
I think that you just really love to write because you've somehow found the time. Thus the 6 years of process. Right?
Yes.
And, in the 5 minutes that we have left, I want to talk about the marketing. And I want to give a special shout out to Mo Hanley in Milton, because she featured you in one of her home literary salons where she has neighbors and friends in Milton come to hear a featured author, and she strongly recommended you for the show, and I'm really grateful to have read the book and to now have you here. So can you tell us a little bit about what that was like, being in her literary salon, and also, you know, just speaking in general to different places and how you go about that?
Well, being at Mo's was great. I read, we didn't actually read from our books, but I was with Kristen Harnish, who has written several books. She's a friend of mine also. We have published through the same publisher. And it was great. We actually interviewed each other. So we sort of agreed on a couple of questions beforehand, and we interviewed each other. It was great. I think there's about 24 people there, all crowded into Mo's living room, and it was a terrific, very enthusiastic group, and it was a lot of fun.
Now, where can we buy your book?
So the book is available in bookstores. I know that it's in the Walpole, Barnes & Noble, and various other Barnes & Nobles. When it first came out, people would take pictures on their phone. I found your book in Barnes & Noble. That's how I get all these pictures. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble online. There's a lot of places online. It's also available in all sorts of ebook formats. There, you know, Kindle and Nook and, you know, Apple and, you know, I think there's 10 different electronic formats that the publisher puts out there. So it's available in a lot of places.
And how has that been? Social media, you know, what's your facility with social media and different platforms to promote your book?
Well, I ended up really liking Facebook, and in fact, when I first signed my contract with the publisher, I thought, oh, I have to do Facebook, and so I had an old Facebook account, and I sort of went on there as a bit of a chore. This is something I have to do, and then I found I really liked Facebook at that point, so it was sort of became not a chore, and I was just enjoying, you know, being on Facebook. But Facebook has been really great. I have an author page, but I also have a personal page, and both of them have been really great at being able to sort of put out events and articles that I've written, and it's been great. I really love using Facebook. I'm not much of a Twitter user. That seems, I don't know, for the young folk, but I do have a Twitter account, and I occasionally tweet. But it's my heart is with Facebook in terms of social media.
I do. I really love Facebook, and I myself have problems keeping up. Yeah. Equally with all, well, I just don't, but I mean, I do. I really do love Facebook and all. Where, you know, by the time this show runs, where are you going to be in the future? Are you going to be speaking? What are your plans for the new year?
Well, before the new year, the next sort of big thing that's coming up is I'm doing a talk at it's actually at the Nantasket Beach Resort, and the City of Hull has a monthly author series that I guess is very well attended, so they tell me, and that's November 10th. It's a Thursday night, I think. And so that should be really great. They say they get usually about 100 people, so that's a nice size audience to speak in front of. So I'll be doing a presentation there. And then, of course, next year is One Book, One Town in Sharon, which will be great. So I'm looking
congratulations on that. Well, it's been wonderful to have you on the show, Connie. Connie Mayo, look for her on Facebook, ConnieMayo.com. Look for The Island of Worthy Boys, such a great read. I want to thank you for having you on the show today. Really fun. And we'll see you next time on It's All Right with Suzette.